Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. It's going to be titled Why Entrepreneurship Will Save the Economy and Perhaps Your Career. We have an excellent speaker today. His name is Mark Mayette. He is the principal at Entrepreneur Consulting and Coaching, and he is also referred to as an alternative career coach, and he'll explain a little bit more about that. But I just want to let you know kind of how today's session is going to work. Basically what's going to happen is this session is being recorded. After we are finished with this session, it will be posted on our YouTube channel, Technology Association of Georgia. If you have any questions, please wait till the end of the presentation, and Mark will go ahead and answer those. You can type your questions into the chat box on the bottom left-hand corner, and I will send that message out right now so you can all see where it is. And the presentation is going to be about 45 to 50 minutes long, and with that, Mark, I will let you go, and I also just wanted to add in, we want to thank ReadyTalk for sponsoring our webinars. They've been a great help, and if you have any questions about their program, feel free to talk to us after. But with Mark, I will let you take that away.
Perry, thank you very much, and thank you to the Technology Association of Georgia, as well as ReadyTalk in providing the channel by which we'll be actually covering this topic today. As Perry indicated, besides my name, Mark Mayette, one of the ways I like to be referred to as is an alternative career coach. And the reason why I focus on the keyword alternative is that really what I do on a day-to-day basis is work with individuals to help them gain clarity as to whether or not doing something entrepreneurial is in their wheelhouse or not. And so when I say alternative, really that's the alternative that I'm trying to help my clients get clarity around. I don't necessarily work with people's resumes, although I provide a lot of feedback on people's resumes. I don't help them on their LinkedIn profiles, although there's opportunity to do that. There's such a huge opportunity in helping people get their arms around what I like to say, their career 2.0 might look like. And it might be career 3.0 or 4.0. So for the sake of the presentation today, here's some of the things that we plan on covering. Specifically, during today's presentation, we'll talk about what the current state of the economy is, as well as the dynamics in the workforce. We'll spend a little bit of time just getting grounding around what entrepreneurship truly is, and specifically as it relates to today's terms. And then we'll talk a little bit also about introducing a concept that I highlighted in a book I published a few months ago called the E-Band, also referred to as the entrepreneurial band that I came up with when I put the book together. And then the $64,000 question is, how do you begin to get your arms around whether you fit on this E-band and how to determine where you fit? So those would be the four areas that we will focus in on. And as Perry said, if at any time you do have questions, type those in chat, and then when we get to the Q&A portion of today's presentation, we'll be happy to cover those. The fact that you're listening to this or you are involved and viewing this presentation tells me, based on all the number of registrations that occurred for today's event, is that there's a definite pent-up desire, if you will, to really get your arms around what you could be doing entrepreneurially, if in fact that is something that is in the cards or not. And so let's talk a little bit about what the current state of the workforce and the economy are. Going clockwise, starting around 2 o'clock, 1,166 actually is a number that represents the total number of occupations that are tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. When I ask a group how many occupations they think there are, the numbers are usually much higher than what the Bureau actually tracks. Obviously, within the 1,166, there are subcategories that might fall under those, but at the core, there's 1,166 occupations that our economy in its current state is supporting. As we go further down, 80,000 reflects the total number of hours that somebody will dedicate in their working career. So if you consider the fact that you'll be starting work around 16 and you might work till 65 or you might work beyond, approximately the rough number is 80,000 hours will be dedicated to some sort of career or occupation. And then going further up, the 60 million plus number, that is a number that's reflected by the total number of 1099 workers that will be in our economy by the year 2020. We're currently around 40 million 1099. So basically that's people that are effectively free agents. They are contract workers for companies. That research was done by a group called Intuit, Intuit software company. And so they estimate that we are quickly ramping towards and evolving towards a more independent workforce, if you will, with 60 million being projected by 2020. That would be 1099. The 154 million plus number is indicative of the total number of jobs that our current economy is supporting. If you consider that we are well over 300 million in U.S. population, it would indicate that, A, not everybody in our economy as we know it is actually working, working or in a position where they are earning an income, whether it's hourly or salaried positions. But our current economy supports approximately 154 million plus jobs, if you will. The other current state, again going from 2 o'clock clockwise on, is approximately 10% of our population is actually 10% plus is actually underemployed or actually unemployed. Although the number right below it of approximately 5.3%, that's through the more recent Department of Labor stats in our U.S. in the Georgia unemployment rates. 5.3% is what the state and Mark Butler and the Department of Labor will say. That's, we have 5.3% unemployment. The reality of it is, just go to your friends, neighbors, or colleagues. You'll probably know someone that's either no longer being tracked or is underemployed or is doing a job simply to pay bills. Look no further than Lyft or Uber, and then you'll know of some people that are doing things to supplement their income because of that dynamic. The other dynamic is that approximately 20% of the workforce, and this is through Gallup, 20% or 2 out of 10 employees are actively disengaged. Actively, and when I mean active, that means they wish 2 out of 10 in a conference room. You're sitting with 10 in a room of 10 people in a conference room. 2 out of the 10 wish harm on the company that they actually work for. That's pretty stark. 70% plus, also tracked by Gallup, indicate the overall disengagement level of the workforce. These are people that would prefer to be somewhere else, are not engaged, don't feel empowered to make a real impactful difference. They just show up. And heaven forbid if some of those folks are customer-facing employees. I think it's when you put all this together, and then if you incorporate these numbers as well, you'll notice that the way we know work and the way that we interpret work is very stark. 65% don't feel motivated to achieve the company goals. 40% trust the company to keep its promises, and only 20% feel empowered to do the best, as I noted earlier. Overall, the corporate world, or the world of a job, a job, is becoming less appealing. So you put that all together, and then you also add these stats in here, is that in a professional career, 6 to 8 time career job changes, more if you're under 40. If you're a next gen, chances are you'll be having more than 6 to 8 job changes within your professional career. There will be 3 I call them pivots. There will be 3 pivots that people will make during their professional career, where they're going to study a particular topic or major, and then they graduate. They are in that profession, and then within a number of years, they decide they want to get out of that profession and do something completely different. The number one profession where people are pivoting directly out of that profession is law. I would submit that if the barriers to entry were not so high and formidable in healthcare, healthcare would be right beside law in regard to hard reboots or pivots out of within that profession. And last night I attended a friend's retirement party, and this is fitting. 70% of Americans plan to do something. They plan to do some work when they're in their retirement years. And that number was found to be through AARP. So you put all that together, just indicates that the way we interpret work, the way our economy is evolving, it's just there's opportunity for us to take a step back and say, can I be doing something different? And if you look at the history of our economy, we started off as effectively in a self-sufficiency mode where, we adapted, learned a trade, we learned a profession, we provided that service to our village, if you will, and we bartered for services. And then during the Industrial Revolution, when the steam engine was introduced and factories started to get involved in mass production, people left their farms, they left their villages, and decided to get a job. And so that's how our economy over time has evolved. I would submit that we are currently in our next version of the Industrial Revolution, in that we're faced with a scenario where we are evolving our own economy. You look at globalization, you look at technology, you look at how the workforce is being addressed, and we, much like the Industrial Revolution, there was about a 50 to 100 year period where the economy kind of just sputtered along, and then all of a sudden it just really got legs under it and took off, and everybody seemed to be doing fairly well. I would submit that we are approaching that evolution as well, where we might be in a fairly unstable environment for the next number of years until all the boats seem to be rising. And I would submit that the way that we're going to address that will be, or potentially through entrepreneurship. Here's some more sobering facts, and this is specifically isolated to the United States. And these numbers are being tracked by the CDC here in Atlanta. But for the 40 and 50-year-olds out there within our U.S. Economy, we have 3 areas that are really are spiking. Depression is spiking. Addiction is spiking. And here's a more sobering incident, but suicide is spiking in the 40 to 50-year-old demographic. And the root cause of all of this, depression, addiction, and suicide, the root cause is rooted in, quite frankly, economic despair. And there are certain subsets of the 40-50 demographic where it's much more glaring. Specifically, white males in the 40, 50-year-old age range are experiencing these at near, if not at, epidemic proportions, to the point where other industrialized countries are looking at this data and saying, what is going on in the United States? It's pretty sobering. So that's what drove me to write the book that I wrote and released several months ago, which is taking some of these data points and saying, what can we be doing to help people begin to figure out whether or not they should seriously consider entrepreneurship or doing something entrepreneurial as a way of addressing their own issues that they have. I use the term entrepreneur in a more positive way. We've heard, if you listen to Shark Tank or other programs, sometimes entrepreneur is bantered around as kind of a dismissive word. I define entrepreneur as anybody that hasn't actually taken the step to become an entrepreneur, but in the back of their mind they're thinking or they have some sort of motivation or interest in doing something entrepreneurial. So until they do that, they are what I define as a entrepreneur. So the book helps people begin to go through a more structured process to get their arms around whether or not they should actually go down that road. When you consider your career life cycle, I am 55 years old, and I'm in my, I would say, my third quarter, if you will. But there's generally quarters, if we break it down, in our career cycle. We go to school, we learn a skill, we get a degree, and then if you follow the data, a bulk of our time will be spent in the first quarter is going to be actually practicing or executing in a role that we were trained or educated in. And then you'll notice as the second, third, and fourth quarters kick in, the amount of time that we're spending in a specific role or task or profession begins to go down. And no pun intended, but, as I like to say, after the fourth quarter, what usually happens, it's, as I say, sudden death. So if you break your career down into 4 quarters, and depending on where you fall on this quartile, you might find that you're either in the first, second, third, or maybe even the fourth quarter of your professional career. So the book, Entrepreneur, and the topic today is less about why you should consider becoming an entrepreneur, although I gave you some supporting data to support the fact that you probably need to take a step back and assess whether or not that's an option. But it's less about why. And it's also, the book is less about how to become an entrepreneur, because it's much more focused on what you should be doing to discern whether or not entrepreneurship is in your wheelhouse or not. Which brings us to the next part, which is, and the key takeaway, if there's anything you get out of this presentation, is that it's all about wiring. And research also indicates that your wiring that you were born with, much like a thumbprint, everyone has a separate thumbprint. We have, if you look at snowflakes that fall out of the sky, if you're from the north, every snowflake is different. And I would submit that, and data supports this as well, is that your wiring that you have developed, refined, and over time may have enhanced, was baked by the time you were 14 years old. If you take and put people through specific assessments that I use, some of the assessments I have would indicate that 1 in 34 million people are wired very closely. So in other words, there's one example of an assessment called Strength Finders through Gallup. They have 34 attributes or talents that they identify. And the probability that two people will have the same 1 to 5 talents as their top talents is 1 in 34 million. So the fact that you might be listening to this presentation saying, I'm thinking of becoming or doing something entrepreneurial, I would submit that your motivation to do that should not be based on your motivation that you might feel when you watch Shark Tank, or the fact that you've got a friend that started a company and you feel like you're left out, or you observe classmates from business school that have started something and they're just reaping the rewards. So that should not be the motivation for you necessarily to even consider doing something entrepreneurial. I mean, it's great models, it's great examples, but when it all comes down to it, is you need to be and you need to understand what your wiring is to determine whether or not doing something entrepreneurial is in your wheelhouse or not. So it brings me to the next point, which is how do you define entrepreneur? And when I poll audiences, I get all sorts of varying definitions. One definition through Entourage is entrepreneurship is living a few years of your life like most people won't, so you can spend the rest of your life like most people can't. And it's a tongue-in-cheek type raw definition of Entourage from Entourage. The one I prefer to use is and refer to is from Merriam-Webster. The core, if you just boil down what entrepreneurship is, it's someone who organizes, manages, assumes the risk and rewards of a business or enterprise. At the core, that's what an entrepreneur is. If you read the book Millionaire Next Door, that was a classic that was written a number of years ago by two gentlemen, Stanley and Danko out of Atlanta. They identified in their work that the millionaires next door many times were the folks that appeared to have very humble surroundings, drove a Ford 150 pickup truck, and were very unassuming. Yet they were the core of the millionaires that their research seemed to uncover. And it wasn't necessarily people in highly professional careers, whether they're physicians or high-powered attorneys, etc. But at the core, when you boil it down, entrepreneurship is someone who organizes, manages, and assumes the risk of a business or enterprise, and it can be fairly simple. So now with that being said, and getting back to the motivation piece, a number of people, and I think the research based on what I talked about early on about engagement and disengagement in the workforce, our data suggests that 75% of the people in the U.S. have a desire to become self-sufficient. Not self-employed, but self-sufficient. Much like people that are independent farmers or independent tradesmen that might barter or might provide a service for their village, if you will. And they have a relatively simple existence, but they are self-sufficient. 75% of our population has that motivation. Yet, only 5% will actually take a step to make that happen. Only 5%. Which brings us to the reason, well, why could that be? And at the end of the day, what it boils down to is what I affectionately call fear. But I don't mean fear in the form of overwrought with emotion, but I talk about more false evidence appearing real. You make a decision or you don't do something because you're basing it on either feedback or on insight or on perception of why you should do something or why you shouldn't. But fear, and the number one reason is that's what holds most people back. I would submit if you go through a more protracted assessment to really understand your wiring, what that would do is that would mitigate any level of fear that you might be experiencing or colleagues might be experiencing if, in fact, they're considering doing something entrepreneurial. So that's what brings us to the concept of the E-band or the entrepreneurial band, the opportunity you'll have and opportunity people will have when they do a more thoughtful assessment will be to determine, do I fit on this E-band and where do I seem to be predisposed? And how I define E-band in the book, was, on one end, entrepreneurship at the core is doing a startup. Research will indicate, and research has supported this, that more people today qualify for Mensa, and that's people with IQs over 130. I'm not in that category, so I can't tell you specifically what the IQ number is, but more people qualify for Mensa, over 10% of our population qualify for Mensa, than are wired to actually do a startup. And a startup is defined as a business that you start literally from scratch, and then you grow into a major corporate entity. Less than 2% of our population is wired to do startups. Probably no accident. If there's anybody on this call that is considering doing a startup, you're probably bored by this presentation. If you're even on this presentation, people that do startups are already doing it. They don't need to be listening to a webcast. They don't need to be reading a book. But less than 2% of our population is wired to do that. But startup is on the far end. The other one is where a core of our economy is based, which is small businesses. And these are small businesses that are standalone businesses, whether they're mom and pops, family-owned enterprises providing a service product to the local economy. A core of our economy is driven by standalone businesses. I know that TAG has, I imagine, Perry, it's probably into the 30,000 members. A majority of the people that are in those that are members of TAG might very well be not part of a standalone business, but might be part of businesses that have multiple offices, multiple locations, etc. But a core of our economy is driven by businesses that are standalone businesses. Another area of entrepreneurship falls under what I call a business in a box. Probably no accident, but categories of businesses that fall under here are biz ops, business opportunities, where a majority of those people that are executing a biz opportunity out of their house are women. And it's to provide additional income, is to provide some financial stability to their family. But another area within business in a box is, for example, a templated business that might be franchised. The business has decided that they want a template or provide a template to their business model and then sell rights to independent business operators that will take their template and basically create a business for their local economy and run with it. There's numerous business categories in this space, but a business in a box is the third area. And then the fourth is getting back to the 1099s, where people have learned a particular skill, they have a particular acumen, and they've determined to become a free agent. And so they work on a contract basis as a 1099. But remember that key concept is that we talked about earlier in this presentation. Depending on what your wiring is, depending on what your background is, depending upon what your interests are, depending upon what your goals are as it relates to income, lifestyle, wealth accumulation, building equity in a business, all of that and your wiring lend itself to helping you figure out, do I fit on this band or not? And some people don't. Yet a lot more people do. They just need to be able to be helped to come to that conclusion. And there's a way to actually do that, which the next slide we'll talk about, which is how do you figure out if and where you fit on this entrepreneurial band. The first thing to do, and the book goes into some detail about it, but is to take a step back and reflect. What have you enjoyed? What do you like doing? What are your interests? When you're not working, what are you doing? What are you naturally good at? What are your talents? What do people comment on about you that come naturally to you, so that to others it doesn't come naturally. So a lot of it is reflection. A lot of it's also through a more formal coaching experience. You might have somebody help you begin to reflect on through proactive questioning and filling out forms, etc. But reflection is the first phase. The second step is to get feedback. Be open to feedback, and the feedback might be provided in feedback that you might receive after you've done an assessment, an online assessment or some sort of assessment. You'll get feedback immediately in some sort of output or report. There are numerous assessments, and as it relates to entrepreneurship, there are some that are coming online that will help you measure which talents you might have that might lend themselves specifically to entrepreneurship, and they're scientifically based. And you have some assessments that might not be scientifically based, so I would submit, lean in on the ones that have scientific backing to them. But you're going to gain feedback. The next phase is as you reflect, as you get feedback, the light bulb should start getting some juice. In other words, you'll gain some insight. You'll gain insight in regard to, whether or not doing something entrepreneurial is in your wheelhouse or not. You'll also gain some aha moments, which is what you like about the prospect of doing something entrepreneurial, what you don't like or what concerns you about it. As you go through this proactive process, you'll start to gain insight as to the merit of doing something entrepreneurial. And then subsequent and in conjunction as you're going through this, I would also highly recommend people to learn and to educate themselves about the prospect of doing something entrepreneurial. And the education has, and like all the previous categories, have a number of layers to it, but the education could include an online course, taking courses in any number of programs, reading books, talking to people that support entrepreneurs, as well as beginning to figure out whether or not, if you want to go down this road, how should you set up your legal entity? Will it be a sole proprietor? Will it be an S Corp? Will it be a C Corp? Will it be an LLC? How should I set myself up? So part of that will be around education. The one thing I want to emphasize, though, as it relates to education, is that if you're not wired to do something entrepreneurial, guess what? Taking a course is not going to make you entrepreneurial. And an example I like to use is the movie Rudy. You remember the fellow that spent years trying to become a football player at Notre Dame, worked as a groundskeeper for a number of years, got denied admission to Notre Dame 3 separate occasions, and finally got admitted. And then literally, the culmination of his college career was a single play at the end of a game that Notre Dame already had solidly in its court, that he played one play. And in some ways, it was very inspirational to people. But the reality is he expended so much energy to achieve that one play at the college level. So some people would argue that his talent, his core talent, was not, say, a Joe Montana at the Joe Montana level, who's also a Notre Dame grad as well. Joe Montana went to Notre Dame as Rudy did, but he came to Notre Dame with a tremendous amount of raw talent that he built up and developed into strengths through his playing days leading up to Notre Dame. But he continued to hone them, work hard at those talents, and created a lot of strength in his athletic ability to play football. So it could be argued that if you have the raw talent and you focus on those, it becomes a really powerful strength. Unlike if you don't have the raw talent, but you have a tremendous amount of heart, i.e. Rudy, your results and outcomes might not be as as positive or powerful than someone who had the talents to begin with. But education is part of it. Roundabout way of saying education is part of it. The other one is besides reflection, feedback, insight, education, it's also going to be resources. So part of that process will be identifying what resources will I need if, in fact, I'm going to go down this entrepreneurial road. I talked a little bit about professional advice you might receive, whether it's legally or financially, about how you would set up your entity. Other resources include financial resources. How do you capitalize your investment? How do you capitalize your business? How do you ensure that if you do, in fact, want to go down this road, that it will be sustainable? Number one reason why businesses fail is they run out of capital. So resources is going to be part of it. And then you put that all together, you multiply the reflection, the feedback, the insight, the education, the information you gain through your various resources. You multiply all of that by your level of confidence. And as you go through the first phases of the assessment, as you go through it, you will either gain in confidence or you will not gain in confidence. The more confident you are, obviously, the more likely you'll probably be in that 5% area. But at the end of the day, what that will all equate to, though, is what I refer to as C2, in this case, clarity. If you go through reflection, you go through feedback, you go through insight, you go through education, you gain resources, learn about the resources, you multiply that by your confidence level, you will get to a point of clarity as to whether or not doing something entrepreneurial is in your wheelhouse or not. And you'll decide, I want to go down that road. I've gone through the assessment. I really feel good about it. Or, I've had clients that I've actually worked with that have gone through this process and they've determined that they really needed to find a job or to be in something that they have tremendous amount of support that might afford them some level of entrepreneurial or independence. But at the end of the day, they needed a lot more support than probably they were in a situation to actually execute on. So they gained clarity, though. So I would submit that there's some additional resources outside of what I've just outlined. One of them is the book. It's available on Amazon, either a Kindle version or the hardcover version. The other thing I would say is if you're in this point, get a coach. And the way I define a coach, this is my definition of a coach. So a coach is somebody that helps the eye see what can't be seen, the ear hear what can't be heard, and the mind process what can't be processed alone. So if you sense that, it would be helpful to have someone that's working on your behalf to try to get you to a point of clarity, and their only motivation is to get you to that point of clarity, then by all means lean in on a resource like a coach. Although success might look like this, the reality of what success might actually look like might be a squiggly line with an arrow going upward, but it might have a lot of twists and turns. But it can look like this if you lean in on resources such as myself or an alternative career coach to help you figure that out. So with that being said, Perry, I'm not sure how chat has been going, but let me pause here if there's any comments or questions that have come up during the presentation.
So we haven't gotten any questions yet, but I just typed in the chat box. Anyone is welcome to post some questions in there. I'm going to read them to Mark.
Yep.
Go ahead. We'll give it about a minute or two for people to start writing them. I see that Timothy has his hand raised. Let's see. What's the question, Timothy? So Timothy Miller has a question. I'm going to just wait to see what he has to say. We'll just give that a second.
And while you do that,
yes.
And while you do that, Perry, while people think of questions, let me just bring up a question that I usually get asked around this presentation, which is, Mark, are entrepreneurs born or are they made? And as I indicated, research does lean towards the fact that your entrepreneurial attributes or your talents that could be segued into doing something entrepreneurial are baked by the time you're 14 years old. Another question I get from time to time is that who's more successful, a millennial next-gen entrepreneur or somebody that's in their 40s? Data supports the fact that if you decide to do something entrepreneurial and you're in your 40s, your degree of success is higher than somebody who's a next-gen or millennial that decides to do something entrepreneurial. And the reason is, and the data seems to support this, is that the people in their 40s generally have a lot more self-efficacy. They already know or have a stronger idea about what they like, what they're good at, what their wiring is, whether it's consciously they know it or unconsciously they know it. They seem to be comfortable in their own skin. The other thing that comes up generally is that people in their 40s have more resources, whether they're financial resources that they've accumulated in their professional careers, and or network capital, if you will. They've developed a professional network in a specific category or industry that they can leverage in their business, and it's also the ability to gain experience in their professional career also lends itself to parlaying that into something entrepreneurial. So those are two questions that usually come up.
So we have a question from Charles. He said, I missed it, but can you go back and explain the difference between the standalone and the 1099 or the 1099 folks?
Yep. So in this one, let me just go back here. All right. So this is the event, okay? So a standalone is just a single physical entity. It's a business, like a dry cleaning business, some sort of store. It might be a painting company, a single guy or a single painter with one truck. But it's literally like a mom and pop business entity that is by itself. The 1099 is just by the definition of it is if you're a independent contractor providing a service, you generally don't have a lot of assets that a standalone business would need to have. You're just basically a person for hire that's going to provide a particular service or product. How you file your taxes and how you do that, the accountant will help you that. But those are the two big differences between the two.
Okay, we have another question. This is from Timothy. How do you establish fees for new consultancy company? I have RE fees, time-based or project-based or old salary plus value added. Any thoughts? So the way I'll paraphrase that. So how do you determine how you'll charge for your services? That's kind of at the end of at the core. Is that at the core, Perry, of what he's asking? It seems to be, yeah, based on fees. Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
So part of it will be, if you're in the point where you're trying to figure out how do I charge a fee for the service or product that I'm providing. You mentioned consultancy. One rule of thumb might be is to look out in the marketplace to see what is the market bearing currently. How are some of the consultancies that are currently established charging a fee? Are they charging an hourly rate? Are they charging a rate for a certain period of time? I've seen some coaches actually put a one-time payment for a 3-month engagement. I've seen some consultants, when they do the research, have landed on some sort of gain share type of a consultancy where they do not charge a fee up front, but if their consultancy nets out a savings, a hard dollar savings, or some sort of economic gain in the client that they're working with, they will take a percentage of that gain share. So those are three specific examples. I would suggest assess the marketplace and what consultancy service you would be providing, and just do a landscape analysis to determine how are others charging for the consultancy that I'm looking to establish.
I haven't received any more questions, so we'll give it about another minute, and if anyone has any more questions, type them in the chat box, and we'll just see what goes from there. So we'll give it about another minute.
That's fine. And while that comes up, I'll just put my contact information there as well as my LinkedIn profile, so that if anyone would like to reach out and connect and even follow on and have a follow-on discussion or about the presentation, by all means, let me know, and that will have my contact information in there as well.
All right, we got another question from Charles. What are some strategies to build credibility as an independent consultant? An example, why would a company hire an individual consultant versus an established firm?
Yeah, I think that's the number one, I think, the opportunity people have, especially if they're relatively new in their consultancy. Obviously, references are important. And again, if you're establishing a new consultancy, then garnering those references will take some time. When I talked about the difference between a millennial versus an over 40, chances are if you're over a certain age, over 40 as an example, you've amassed a certain network, people that know you, people that are aware of the benefit that you have, what your gifts are, and chances are introductions, referrals, letters or recommendations are going to be really important to establish yourself. Another way to establish a little bit more credibility at the core is about establishing relationships. So if you're looking to establish a presence in a particular market or industry, identify which groups or associations are actively involved in that industry. I would suggest become a member. I would also suggest volunteer. I would also suggest being a resource. And as people know you and you establish relationships, then one, as I like to say, one mind at a time approach will begin to net some sort of benefit to you. Another example is what I'm doing today. It might be raising your hand to be a speaker at an upcoming event. In this case, the Technology Association of Georgia has numerous special interest groups within TAG that you might raise your hand and say, I'm very passionate about this topic. I would welcome the opportunity to speak to your members about this. And that also enhances your presence in a particular market as well. The last thing I'll say is identify strategic relationships or people that you can get to know and they get to know you, where you might be able to identify opportunities that you will strategically align your service with their product or service, and you become a resource to them. And so in this case, 1 and 1 will equate to 3 in that case. So a number of different strategies.
So we have another question from Jimmy. What are some of the tips for successfully transitioning from a full-time job to an entrepreneur? You'll hear different schools of thought. You'll see if you read up on it on the internet or you just see different, listen to different thought leaders, some will say, put a stake in the ground and go for it. You'll hear somebody else say, well, keep your day job and then start this enterprise on the side. And then as it gets traction, then you'll be able to eventually move away from your full-time gig when you've established your other business that you've been doing on the side. At the core, it all goes back to wiring, I think, because there's some individuals that can multitask very well, and then you have others that are wired differently, that they will find, I really need to separate myself from my day-to-day role
and just go for it. And so what that will require is not only a supportive network, but a supportive family, and then also a financial strategy that will allow you to do that during the startup phase. So there's any number of ways that you could probably approach it. I would submit part of it might be is to really assess what your wiring is and determine what will work for you and will fit your risk tolerance, if you will.
Well, that was all the questions we had today. I guess that will conclude the session. But, Mark, I want to thank you so much for participating and helping us run this webinar. And thank you to all the participants today that came. The session is recorded, so it will be up on our YouTube channel next week at Technology Association of Georgia. And, again, thank you so much, Mark, for talking to us today. We really appreciate it.
Perry, my pleasure, and thank you all for listening to the presentation, and I wish you a very impactful days, months, years ahead. All the best.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Mark. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.